This was in 2016, so I'd heard him speak. I think I was there the day. I was also sent to the Hilton the day after Trump picked his vice president, and I don't think Mike. I have to remember. I don't think Mike Pence came back for that trip. It might have been too quick, but there was an event there, and he gave like a little speech. So I've been to those events, and then I've covered the election nights late into the night as well.
You said you had an encounter. Excuse me. You said you went when you were a Penn student. That he came to Penn for something. Was it Wharton thing? Was it?
Yeah, it was one other time, right? So in 1999, it's almost 20 years ago. It'll be 20 years in November. Trump came to Irvine Auditorium for a taping of Hardball with Chris Matthews. Back when Chris Matthews was starting his show. Matthews had done these campus tours, sort of in the run-ups to the election. He brought Jesse Ventura to Harvard, maybe a month before that. I'm not sure what connection Jesse had with Ventura. Probably the same one that Jeffrey Epstein had with Harvard. That's a joke. It's okay. It's fine. I don't know. So for some reason that was a pairing. They wanted to do another campus event. Theo Lecomte, who was a Penn student at the time, he has since run 2 Democratic national conventions as like a high executive of operations. He was running SPEC, which plans a lot of events on campus, and he wanted to do like a debate or political event sort of thing. So he had contacted Chris Matthews about doing an event there. Chris Matthews thought, well, why don't we just get Trump? He's a Penn alum. That'll be interesting. And Trump was thinking about running for president back in 1999 as a Reform Party candidate. So Theo needed bodies to be on the stage and in the auditorium. He sent a bunch of flyers around. I thought, well, I'm not doing anything then. So I went to that. It was strange.
Strange and define strange.
Strange in that Chris Matthews was treating Trump as a legitimate presidential candidate back in 1999. They thought that Trump might actually be the Reform Party nominee, and Trump was certainly acting like it. He had a big tax plan that he was talking about. I think taxing like a multi-trillion-dollar income tax or wealth tax. I have to remember the specifics of it, but not out of place in something Elizabeth Warren might propose. He didn't remember the specifics of it either, because a student asked him about it, and he couldn't explain it very well, about as well as I can explain it now. But it was like an hour, 90-minute long conversation. It was taped. You can see it. It's still on YouTube, and that was probably the first major, after Larry King's sort of "I'm thinking about running" announcement. That was the first sort of major TV exploration of Trump as a nominee. And that was in 99, and he was a very different candidate back then.
Well, so all right, so in terms of what was your perception of Trump, especially if we're talking about the question of, is he just, let's pose it this way, is he, because this is what everybody keeps asking themselves, is he unhinged or is there calculation, or is it something in between? Did you have what was your basic perception of him before you started talking to all these people for the book, and has your perception, your own, changed in the wake of the book?
We had thought that there was more calculation to him than people were giving him credit. I mean, certainly he reacts, emotionally from his gut, however you want to say that. But we thought there was some bit of calculation. Certainly it wasn't an accident that he became president, that he got millions of people to vote for him, millions of conservatives, that he was able to sway the Tea Party, that he was able to figure out how to get on the ballot, that he was able to bring in all these advisors and be a good communicator and use Twitter effectively. Like, none of that is an accident, but it was being treated as such. And we wanted to sort of look more into, well, what is it that Trump mastered over the past 20 years that made him a compelling figure for the Republican Party of 2016 and for conservative voters?
Okay, so you feel now that So you had that sense now, but you feel now that there's more of a Machiavellian calculation to what he does. I'm actually setting up another question by asking you that.
I think so. We didn't quite understand how driven he was about politics. The 99 run is something that gets touched on briefly. He thought about that very deeply, and we didn't quite realize how serious he was back in 2011, whereas going through the same motions and hiring like some of the pollsters who still work for him now, like John McLaughlin, and he hired Dick Morris, too. Dick Morris, if you remember, was Bill Clinton's master triangulator. He's the one who made Bill Clinton more of a centrist figure around the second term. And they also knew each other growing up as kids, which is something that, we didn't know either. But Trump, we didn't quite understand Trump's rootedness in politics and how that shaped him as a person. I think that was probably one of the biggest surprises.
All right. Well, so one of the themes of the book, obviously, is that yes, he was planning this. He was actually, he studied how to tweet. He had some counsel on how to tweet and how to build a Twitter audience, and he was kind of seeding the ground for, as you said, for a long time, for 20 years. And there are a number of people, I think, in politics now, columnists, who are now saying that yes, that even the birther stuff that he hurled at Obama was calculated in the sense that he was able to, that there was a receptive audience within the conservative camp for that, within the base. But the question I think probably a lot of people have now is, I'll make this very concrete. This morning, on the morning of 9/11 anniversary, he's rage tweeting about, quote, Crooked Hillary, Sleepy Joe, and Pocahontas on the morning of 9/11. Now, is there a method to that, or is that more on the madness end of the scale?
Well, the madness, we found, the madness is the method. It's the ability to try to shift the news cycle in the way that reflects back to him is what he's always thinking about. So if he can't say something that's, nice and commemorative about 9/11, he's going to try to figure out how to bend the news cycle to his argument, because he's powerful enough to do that now. 9/11 is tricky. I think I was here in Philadelphia when that happened. When you go to New York, it's really such a part of the fabric of downtown. That area's become a massive tourist destination, to the surprise and chagrin of many of us who've been in New York for a long time. I can still never go to the museum, but they certainly get many people. I think that Trump and 9/11, I know this is not exactly what you asked, but since this is, I don't think he was really a part of that memory. It's hard for people to react to that or know how to react even still. And I think that maybe some of the tweets that are happening now are part of that too. He still doesn't know quite how to react to that. And to 9/11, yeah, he's not thinking of himself as like, how would a president react to 9/11? I mean, he went to the Pentagon today. They did a ceremony and everything. That's probably all that he thought he needs to do. But it's also been long enough that he's thinking about the future. He's thinking about how can he keep the narrative on himself and his campaign and winning. And I think that's dominating even on a day like today.
All right. So one other example, and you can tell me if you think this is also, as you said, the madness is the method. Does this fall under that category too? Taking a Sharpie and changing a National Weather Service map to redirect a hurricane in order to be proven right? I mean, is there method to that?
Yeah, I think it's, again, he thought he can do it. A lot of this are, that was the reaction that he had in the moment, whereas he saw maybe not most of the lines going towards the Florida coast, but a couple of lines outside of the system. And he thought, oh, maybe there's a couple of probabilities where it could go through Alabama, and so I'm just going to highlight that too. I think it's just a matter of him misunderstanding weather probabilities and then marking a print page like he would if he's writing a note on an article that somebody wrote, and if he wants to, underline it and write very nice if he likes something. I think that's the same impulse that he has, is to get that pen, write on it, and edit something in his own way. And I think that's what we saw. It's probably a little less complicated than all of this. But it's just him not understanding the probabilities and going in and editing, and that was the impulse he had at the time.
Do you think that there's, does it actually, I understand, like I was saying before, that the rise of, the birther issue helped him rise through the primaries, clearly. So there was a political benefit to pushing that, and the book actually makes clear that he wasn't one of the original people on it, but he got onto it, and he apparently, according to your book, said to Mika Brzezinski off camera, I have the quote here, "I know it's bad, but it works."
Yeah.
So that there was political calculation to that. Do you think that he, without trying to play, of course, our dime store psychology here, but do you think he sincerely believes that by, say, rage tweeting or wielding the Sharpie or some of the other stuff that he does, which feels to me impulsive, that there is actually a political benefit toward winning re-election? Does he think that it's going to does he think enough that it's going to broaden his appeal to at least get close to half the electorate?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's where a lot of this is coming from. If you want to read why he does certain things the way they do, it's because they're going to appeal primarily to his base. His way of winning is to get more of his voters to the polls, and like-minded voters who maybe didn't vote in the last election. This is going to be a turnout election for him, not necessarily a, convincing the electorate. That's probably less likely, and that's what they know. They're going to try it anyway. What was the second part of the question?
No, I think that was the question. I'm also curious about the book itself. It's an oral history, as we were saying. So if you haven't picked it up yet, you'll see. Basically, you guys are quoting a lot of people, and there's some Rashomon in there. There's some people who disagree on whether he was a Democrat before or whether he was always a Republican, and et cetera, et cetera. I'm just curious in terms of how an oral history like this gets put together. I mean, you did some fact checking along the way, because you can see at the bottom of the page when people say things that are outrageously wrong, you guys are pointing it out. But, how much, it sounds like a very labor intensive process to record, I assume, all these things and try to sort of cull through transcripts to make a narrative.
So yeah, all of our interviews were recorded. We spoke with 114 people on the record. There's another handful that I think we spoke with who didn't make it into the book. But what happens is, we either call them on the phone or record them in person, and then fortunately, we've had interns that we hired listen to the recording and write the transcript from that. And then it's a matter of opening up multiple transcripts on a computer and sort of toggling between them when they're talking about the same event or period of time, and cutting and pasting different paragraphs that makes sense. We tried to limit opinions, so we didn't want to let, like, Tucker Carlson, for instance, just sort of go off and explain why something might happen without any grounding in fact. But if he did have a direct story or interaction with the president, we kept that part in. So some of these interviews were edited. Also, if, the way people talk, there's pauses and extra words. They might start a sentence, shift to another idea. So we try to edit those, and we explain that is part of the process, because otherwise the book would be incomprehensible.
Now I see right on the cover of the book you have very prominently it says no anonymous sources. And there's obviously a lot of and you talk about this a little bit in the introduction, that very often in any kind of political coverage, especially when there are people who have frank and candid opinions, but they're afraid of retaliation if they're named, will go on background, or whatever term you want to use. Were you and so there is none of that in this book, at least in terms of the people everybody's on the record. Were you at all tempted were you talking to people who who said things to you that you felt were candid things about Trump that perhaps you would have wanted to use that might have added some nuance to the book, but felt it was going to be taking away credibility to just have anonymous sources?
Yeah, I think it's, this book reads like a play, in that we have sort of short segments from person to person. And everyone's named, so if you have an anonymous source in there where you don't know who's saying it or what their connection was to the event, it's harder to fact check, and it's hard to place that person in the same, with the same amount of weight as somebody who puts their name to it. It would just look out of place. So we found that we had more than enough from people who were present, people like Steve Bannon, Roger Stone, Sam Nunberg, David Bossie, John McLaughlin, various people who worked for Trump, some of whom were in the doghouse, out of the doghouse, back in the doghouse, en route to the doghouse, en route back to the White House, maybe. We'll see what happens with Steve Bannon.
Yeah. John Bolton could be in your follow-up book, right?
Bolton, yeah. We did reach out to people who wouldn't go on the record, and they're not in the book. Jeb Bush isn't in the book. I think this election's probably still bitter for him. Al Gore isn't in the book. I think the 2000 election is probably still bitter for him. But people in the audience may still be bitter about the 2000 election.
I think one of the things I found really fascinating, actually, in the very earliest parts of the book, was talking about Trump's early, when he's just a mogul here, or alleged mogul, his early relations with the New York tabloid media. And some of the people from the tabloid media who are basically quoted in the book basically saying, I'm paraphrasing here, sure, he'd call us up with some gossip, and all he asked in return was that we refer to him as a billionaire in print, that was kind of the transactional favor. And they said, sure, we'll call him a billionaire, and it would go in as billionaire Donald Trump, and he really wanted that in front of his name. But people didn't really fact check it at the time. The press didn't fact check it, the tabloid press. And there was a great quote from Lloyd Grove, who I think writes a lot now for Daily Beast, who was at the Washington Post. And this was back when he was in the New York tabloid world. And there's a quote in the book early on where he's saying, I didn't really challenge him on the facts. So I guess in that sense, I was being an enabler and lazy. Kudos to Lloyd Grove for being so honest about that. My question is, and I know this is hindsight, but if the tabloid press in the late 80s had been a little bit more vigilant and done the job of fact-checking, particularly on the billionaire thing, and said, we're not going to call you that because we don't think that's true or we can't confirm that. If they'd been a little bit more vigilant about him, would he have gotten the oxygen to launch him as a national media figure?
Yeah, that's very hard to say. I can say that what that did for him, it probably did help propel his 1999 race, because he had these relationships with the press, with the mainstream press, not the Foxes, not the Fox News, not the conservative outlets, but the New York Times, NBC, CBS, ABC. And he would call them, in Time Magazine, he would call them, and summon them to Trump Tower and say, I'm running for president, here's why, back in 1999. So I think the tabloids gave him the oxygen to run in that race, and probably more importantly, shaped the perception of him as a successful executive when all of his businesses were failing, when he was casinos and a lot of other developments were in near bankruptcy around the turn of the century. It gave him the image of a successful businessman so that Mark Burnett would pick him to host The Apprentice. And I think hosting The Apprentice is what gave him the oxygen to run for president.
All right,
and gave him an audience who saw him as a successful executive who looked like a president. which is probably as important.
All right. Well, I'm going to ask a broader question about media coverage,
Okay,
and then we're
sure,
going to open it
yeah.
up to you all for questions in like 2 minutes or so. All right. So, do you have any deep thoughts at this point about what the and I know the press isn't. I say the media. It's not monolithic. So, but I'll stipulate to that. But the press, the mainstream media, for lack of a better term, about what they're doing right in covering Trump now and what they're doing wrong? I know it's a broad question, but land anywhere you.
Yeah, I think a lot of the day-to-day coverage of what's happening in the White House has been very good, not just at the Times, but at CNN and other in the Washington Post certainly, where you hear something, even if it's just the day-to-day hiring and firings and the parlor games and stuff. That is important. They're doing a good job. There's a lot of leaks coming out of the White House and other parts of the cabinet in different agencies, and I think we need to know what's happening with environmental policy, whether there's going to be drilling in protected lands, whether emissions are getting rolled back, who's formulating those ideas, which conservative judges are getting picked, how does the judiciary approach many of these landmark cases on choice. I think all of that is being done very well. Anything that you see, like records released, records, whether it's a FOIL record or something that gets leaked, I think that's all extraordinarily important for getting a picture, because you have a president now who doesn't respect records, who sort of does things without thinking about the historic legacy or past precedent. So anything with that, like records were foiled, records submitted. Eric Lipton has been doing some great work, right, regarding Turnberry and the U.S. soldiers who might stay overnight whenever the planes fill up at the local airport. That was from Scottish records. So yeah, that's extraordinary work. I could do with less of the punditocracy. I think journalists who are doing this work and then going on TV to opine about it, we've done that a little bit with the book. I don't know. I don't need to do that. I don't know if journalists need to be on TV as much as they are. I don't think they need to be on Twitter as much as they are. So.
All right. I was going to ask something about Twitter, but I'm going to hold back. I assume that this being a somewhat strong subject, some of you are going to have some thoughts you want to share, but pointed questions are preferable as opposed to mini lectures, which sometimes we're impulsed to do on this. We have a microphone back here for anybody who is waving their hand and wants to ask something right here first.
You mentioned people who aren't in the book because they weren't willing to give their names. Did you do interviews with those people? And if you did, where are those tapes? And what about the tapes of your other interviews?
Oh, no, we didn't do interviews with people who wouldn't be named. It was a small number. What usually happens is they just say they decline to be interviewed once we stress that we would prefer to be on the record. But that could get dragged out for months. We have all of the audio interviews stored. We're not sure what we're going to end up doing with them, but we have them in the cloud. They're in the cloud somewhere.
Yeah, there they are.
We have an audio book, which it would have been, I think, too much work to take the original audio from people that we've spoken with. So if you listen to the audio book, or you prefer to listen to that instead of reading, which a lot of people do, and it's a great audiobook. Those are actors reading, including this great impressionist named John DiDomenico, who travels around the country as Trump and experiences a Trump life sort of secondhand or firsthand, depending on how you view it. So
There's a job for everybody.
yeah.
Other question? Right here.
Oh, well, this way it gets
Yeah, this way it'll be
for
on
the
video.
recording. You'll get
so.
picked up.
So you said, I think it was Gore and Bush did not want to, they didn't want to go on the record. They just didn't want to have they didn't want to be interviewed for the book.
Gore's people they didn't want to do it. We spoke with his campaign manager, Tony Coelho, who's a disability rights advocate and was I think House Majority Leader at one point before that. So we did speak with people around them. Ralph Nader and Joe Lieberman are in the book.
Oh,
They're less bitter. Ralph was very funny.
I'm bitter towards Ralph.
Ralph,
That's another subject.
Pat Buchanan was in the book too. Strangely, Pat Buchanan and Ralph Nader are friends. They talk. I would have liked to have more space devoted to that, but it's not. This book isn't really about sort of odd fellows like that. I don't know whether Trump would become friends with Jeb. I don't think so.
I don't think Jeb would become friends with Trump.
Yeah. It's not all conservatives in the book. Al Sharpton, Gloria Allred, Jerry Nadler, a number of Bob Torricelli, the senator from New Jersey, who happens to be a Democrat but is Trump's friend still. So they're all in the book. And Ed Rendell, who talks about sort of everything. They were friendly. He still was friendly, but Trump got upset at Ed because I think Ed sent something critical in the middle of the decade, maybe around the birther controversy. Or something else, and so Melania snapped at him, or Trump said Melania snapped at him. I'm not sure what happened.
Right here.
Well, being that he was in television so long, he knew how to manipulate the stories, and in anything, the old story is no publicity is bad publicity. Not what I'm saying is, as long as your name is out there and constantly heard, people hear your name. And when you said when he does these things with 9/11, when he did about the memorial and everything like that, he just wants his name out there so people hear it. But yet, like you said, he's very impulsive in what he says, if it's a lie. But no one seems to pick up on that and say, wait a second, let's follow this through. Even the other party doesn't pick up on it. They haven't learned the skill of how to manipulate and how to work the media. And he's, like you said, he's a master at it. And like you said, as long as his name is keep being heard, people say, this sounds good. The news media and your people like that don't pick it up and say, wait a second, this is not correct. This is manipulation of the market, so to speak. But yet no one seems to ad lib on it.
Well, what's the question? What
So
do
the
you think
question
should
is,
be done?
Why doesn't the news media, like yourself, say, wait a second, this is how this is happening. This is all strictly, to him, it's a television show. But no one seems to bring it up, and you yourself say, wait a second, let us point out to the public what is really happening and how he's manipulating the public.
I think there's certain times when you can do that. Certainly, I think if he says something that can be checked in a way that's manipulative, you have to point it out. CNN does a good job at that when they try to. Of course, they're making choices, right? If Trump's going to do a rally in North Carolina a certain night, if there's a football game that's on, you run the football game. A lot of this it's not necessarily the reporters that do it, it's the executives that have to decide, well, how is the coverage going to be regarding Trump at a certain day? Now, if Trump says that he canceled a meeting at Camp David with the Taliban, you have to figure out what the hell he's talking about. Whether that's bluster or not, whether there was something in the works. So you have to get, your reporters on the ground in Afghanistan to say, ask the Taliban, is this actually happening or not, or is it a bluff? You have to check with national security people. So, it's a complicated answer. There's a lot of different moving parts, but a lot of the responsibility are the executives at television stations and how much they want to cover the circus. And we're going to see. I think the answer is they're going to cover a lot of it in 2020 until people say, I don't want to watch it. And then they'll see ratings dip, and then they'll cover something else.
Wasn't it, correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't it the head of CNN who, or no, maybe it was CBS, you tell me which it is, who said in 2015 when they were covering Trump's rallies, gavel to gavel, as it were, that's saying, this is great ratings. It's great for, I think it was the Les Moonves, or one, if that was his name. This is great for Trump, and it's great for CBS, or was it CNN?
Well, there was
I
the
can't remember.
novelty of it at the time.
Yeah, and it was all
But-
just unchecked. It was
Yeah.
just unfiltered.
So that was probably a mistake. Yeah, you could argue that kind of level of coverage gave him more airtime than the other Republicans in the race, and that probably elevated him in that primary. But he was getting a huge audience. It's hard to, you can't just dismiss the people that support him. You have to try to understand why they support him and why they're drawn, and what are the different subtleties between the super fans who will travel out of state to go see him and fill these rallies versus suburban moms in Philadelphia who are maybe having second thoughts after they voted the first time.
More questions? Right up here.
Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. You have the mic.
You're good.
Okay, go right ahead. Then we'll come down here.
Okay. I'd just like to ask why you think that journalists shouldn't be on TV and Twitter as much as they are.
I think it's a trap. It can be a trap. You have to do it smartly. It's important to explain to people why events are happening, and certainly if you have an article, you're breaking news on it, to explain sort of, your understanding of the sources, sort of why a story is important, and how it can contribute to the future. I think sort of when journalists start becoming when journalists are relied on as pundits, to give their opinion on the stories they're covering and other stories, which you see on Twitter probably too much, then it can become a trap, and it can shape coverage. It can shape audience perception of the outlet that you're with. It's tricky. I think we're seeing some pushback to the Times, where a lot of Times reporters who are on Twitter a lot are sort of, sometimes they reveal biases, and that can be difficult. I think it's important to be cognizant of the biases in your reporting, but not to let your biases lead additional coverage. I don't know. What do you think?
I was just kind of curious because I thought that, as like a younger person, I guess, Twitter and television are more accessible to me than print papers, or if I do read something online and then it tends to be a rather immediate thing, not as immediate as Twitter, but still more immediate than newspapers, which have to go through a longer process and bureaucracy and all of that. I don't know.
It's a hard question. It's something that we still grapple with. The Times doesn't have a public editor anymore, because I think the reporters there sort of were fed up with the past one. But there are times when a public editor can be useful to keeping the institutional voice. Of course, we're in an era where reporters can be fired at will for voicing opinions that the newspaper doesn't like, and that's not good either, right? In some place, not everywhere, right? If they're, but a lot of publishers that own newspapers and other chains can be very conservative, and if you have reporters who come in that might be more center left, they have conflicts. It doesn't always end well. Joe Ricketts shut down DNA Info in multiple cities as soon as they organized. Now, organizing was probably the right thing for those reporters to do, because they wanted benefits or better benefits and things. And this is a whole other conversation, but I don't know. I think Twitter and Facebook and all that, journalists have to be careful about putting opinions about the news, I think, into the news cycle bloodstream, because the audience doesn't distinguish the difference between an article and a journalist's opinion.
So is the problem that they're putting too much of their personal selves into it, or?
They can be. I think it also depends on the outlet. You might have outlets that have a lot more tolerance for that, that want to see, that are okay with a journalist building a brand outside of the paper's brand or the news source's brand, because that ultimately helps bring audience members back to the site. of course, the big question on all of this is, you don't own anything you put on Twitter. That certainly doesn't. It might help your brand as a journalist, but you're not seeing any sort of like monetary value in putting whole thoughts and breaking news on Twitter necessarily. I don't know. It's a complicated thing. I don't know if we're going to see Twitter in 5 to 10 years. We might see something else.
I was just going to say, no, we got the mics right here. I would just add, I think
Sorry, it's media criticism. I'm not great at that. So.
Well, I think there's actually a little bit of a generational divide actually
Yeah.
on all this, and I'm not ascribing you to the older generation, Aaron, but maybe perhaps compared to where you were coming from, I think I've just seen among younger people that they almost expect journalists to say or write what they actually know or what their actual judgments are, that there's some transparency in that the sort of strict objectivity model doesn't allow. They kind of want to know, well, where's this person really coming from? And you can't tell. That I think that's kind of one of the things about social media that I think a lot of people, younger people, I think, gravitate to. So that complicates it too, because you've got different fragmented audiences. And I'll shut up now, and we have a microphone right here. You had a question, and then we're going to go to you, sir.
So,
Sure.
Thank you very much. I'm new to this country, and I've been wondering what are some of the reasons that. Well, you mentioned you and your team interviewed over 100 persons, but what are the reasons that you can see as why these persons are choosing to talk about this major issue?
There's always self-interest.
Some want to get credit for helping Trump become president. I think the people close to him, Sam Nunberg, who's an aide who's been hired and fired multiple times, was one of and Roger Stone, who's currently facing a federal indictment, are people who are architects of Trump's run. It certainly wasn't just Trump himself, although Trump likes to think of that as he's the one who's responsible. And a lot of other aides will say, yeah, this was Trump. He was the most responsible for becoming president. And that's probably true. But somebody had to take him to all these events. Someone had to introduce him to the alt-right, to Breitbart News, Fox News. Somebody had to improve those relationships. It wasn't just Trump himself. Trump would have been fine talking to NBC and listening to talk radio, but people had to nudge him to do certain things. Someone had to tell him how to use Facebook and Twitter, and these were all different people, and they were all important, and they don't widely get the kind of credit that, say, the people around Bill Clinton got for making Bill Clinton president, or the people around Obama, like the David Axelrods, the James Carvilles. Right, I don't think Roger Stone is thought of in the same, and Karl Rove, right? Stone and Sam Nunberg aren't thought of in the same way as those guys are, but they should be.
Yeah, wouldn't you say that there's anybody who wants to talk on the record to a journalist typically has some kind of self-interested reason for doing it, and that maybe that the sweet spot is, yes, they have some self-interest, but what they have to say is also true and valuable. Put the two together.
Yeah, we tried to edit out the self-interest part. Sometimes you'll see some of that get in there with Steve Bannon. He explains sort of his background in nationalism and how he got Trump to think of himself as a nationalist. I think there's a section where Trump says, "Yeah, I'm a popularist." Bannon's like, "No, you're a populist." It's like, "No, I'm a popularist." So he keeps he has this weird understanding of him being popular is what it means to his politics. Like that's how he's going to succeed. But it is essentially sort of the populist nationalist values that he embodied, and that's something that Bannon showed him as well. So, and there's also people who don't like him wanted to go on the record to talk about how much of a I can't probably swear on this, but
Sure you
dislike. How? Yeah. Well, anyway.
Hi, my name's Trish. I'm interested in the research that you did and the hundreds of people that you touched base with. Did not impeachment ever cross the conversation? And in the event that it did, what is your personal viewpoint of the issue of impeachment?
Well, this is the book. So the book goes from 1999 to 2015. Certainly, there are people who think about impeachment. Neera Tanden, who runs the Center for American Progress, some of the other Hillary people we spoke with, we're talking about impeachment a little bit. But mostly, we just narrowed our questions into how Trump became president, not how he could not become president, which is a different book. Yeah, I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think we're going to see impeachment next year. I think the Democrats don't have it. It's just calendar. They don't have enough time to get their act together and go through all the procedures. They'll go through some of the procedures. You see Jerry Nadler starting to call records and narrow the definition of what they're going to look at that could be considered impeachable. But if the public isn't there, and especially mainstream Democrats aren't there yet, they're not going to do it. Now, if he wins, and there's probably a 50% chance of him winning, it's probably higher than what people give him credit for, then it's a different conversation. But it all depends on the Senate, right? So it's, No, the Senate. I mean, you can impeach him with a Democratic majority, but then where are you?
And the people have to be on board. Congress, legislators, and the people have to be on board.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, what she said, Congress, legislators, and the people all have to be on board. So if they're not, he's going to stay there through the rest of the term, and perhaps second term.
So the book, I haven't read it yet, but it sounds kind of anti-Bob Woodward in some ways, right? That you're not constructing this master narrative. Were there other books that you modeled on for this? And did you know this was the structure you were going to use from the start?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to crap on Bob Woodward because he still goes out, in the rain. We'll go and knock on the door of some high-ranking general and get an interview with him, and he may or may not put that person on the record. But he's still like, Bob's doing the work, and he always has, and he continues to do that. It just may not show up in the book that he wrote. We tried to show our work a little bit more. I mean, this is my first book. I'd be very pleased to be compared with Bob Woodward in the same breath, but you can see our work a little bit more, and that we show sort of who's interviewed in what area and during what period of time, and we try to give context as to where they're coming from as well. It's not just people's voices in there. We also write our own narrative in the beginning of chapters, the end, in the middle, sort of setting up what happens, because we don't assume people know. And we didn't know. We had to go back and check. I'm sorry, the second part of your question was?
No, I was just wondering, and I wasn't dumping on words.
No,
it
it's
sounds like
yeah,
a very different structure to your book. I
Yeah.
was wondering, did you from the start say, oh, this is how we're going to do this, or did that emerge as you started doing?
We felt so. Yeah, the first chapter that we wrote was this when Trump was thinking about running for governor of New York. In 2013, 2014. And we were able to get a chapter out of talking to maybe 15, 20 people. It was maybe 12 to 15 people to start, and we added more later. And we thought, with this structure, we could replicate this for other periods. It was good enough. We just needed to get more and more people. So we went setting about seeing how many sources we could pile up who could speak about Trump throughout different times. So the structure sort of revealed itself after we were able to determine we could get enough sources to do this. For models, there's a great, I think Tom Shale's oral history of SNL.
I've got that book. It's a great book.
Excellent book. Tells you exactly sort of how Saturday Night Live became the iconic television show of the latter half of the 20th century. Everyone behind it they could talk with, lots of great sort of behind the scenes inside stories. The Allman Brothers, oral history of the Allman Brothers is another good model for this. So yeah, we looked at that structure, tried to do something similar. There's Chris Smith's History of the Daily Show as well. Chris Smith's a writer for New York Magazine. It's also very good. So there are other books like that. They mostly cover entertainment.
Yes.
Questions? More?
Okay. Yeah, I think of Trump being a con man and not being a very smart one. So what I see is that maybe some of this is caused by the Democrats being kind of lame. And I want to know if you think that has to do with will or with, not being up to the job, intellectually, or what? What is making them so bad at fighting him?
Yeah, that's the second part of that is a hard question. I disagree that he's dumb. I think he's a successful con man. Yeah, he is. He saw the audience. He's good at reading an audience. He's good at emotional intelligence. It's a skill that he built up. Here at Penn, is Martin Seligman still here? Yes. Yeah. So yeah, positive psychology. That is, and Norman Vincent Peale, like his ability to have an overabundant confidence in himself and what his understanding of the world, I think, is driving him. His ability to, it's not something that should be overlooked either. I think maybe Democrats don't have that as much. So they should take Marty's class. If he ever does an executive education class, that's probably, some of them probably don't need it. I don't think Cory Booker needs it. But let's see. Norman, history of, the positive psychology, there's overabundant confidence in his own abilities, his ability to read a room, to understand an audience, his ability to communicate succinctly. It's media training that probably Kamala Harris should get at some point. She could get a little better at that. I think her numbers would go up. There's different things. Different people are good at different things. And Trump happens to be very good at communicating with an audience and reading it and understanding. And that's what you saw with the birthers. That's what you saw with the wall. And we explain that in this book. We show how he does it and where he learned it from and how he got better at it. And in some ways, Penn helped him get that. And I think that's
something that they would not
we can
talk
bring it
about.
back. Something we don't like to talk about. Penn helped him. It gave him the veneer of respectability. He mentions Wharton a lot. He is not shy about mentioning it. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if you want to talk about Penn and Trump more since we are here. But I think it's interesting that Penn doesn't, blast it everywhere that Trump is the prodigal son. I'm going to add one more controversial thing. Is that okay? I think Penn should get the library here, because they should build it. Huh? So it's important. It's important to be able to study what happened. How did this moment in American history happen? And I think that's what we aren't doing that enough. We're reacting. We're not understanding, and I think that'll help us heal from this too. So if there's some way of thinking about that and sort of getting ahead of Trump, I don't know if Trump would ever give records. He's not a records guy, right? Remember when he writes notes and then he rips them up, and then they have some records office has to go back and tape them like it's, some Ben Affleck movie.
Can't we study it and have the library in another state?
Well, they could have it in Trump Tower. That's right. That's the alternative.
It's only
I'm
three
sure
books at
he
the
would-
most. So
Yeah, he would figure out how to monetize it. I'm sure he'll build himself a museum after he's done in Trump Tower or one of his other properties or Mar-a-Lago.
You have somebody back there has a question? And then I'll add one more at the end, and then we'll wrap, folks, okay?
I'd
Go
like
ahead.
to just for a moment go back to the role of journalism in this, because it seems that every day we are victims of this spate of rhetoric that comes from him. And if you're telling us that it's not the journalist's job to challenge him, I mean, you're even talking about this weather map. I mean, you can't, someone should have said that's a 5-day-old map. It's a spaghetti map that isn't even from the National Weather, but they don't. They just kind of excuse it and say, "Well, that's just the way he is, and maybe he thought this." So, whose job is it?
Well, it is a journal.
Other than the TV late night comedians, because that's where you get most of the people who challenge that stuff.
They're getting, the late night people are getting most of the information on it by watching CNN, reading the news. I mean, they're deep news consumers. I know a lot of people in these shows. That's what they do. They spend their day watching the news. They spend their day reading the news. They talk to people in the news. It's hard when you have somebody who lies as consistently as the president, and you have, every time he does it, you have to check it. Washington Post and the Times have been very good at it. There's times when they come up short, when their headline writers write something in a way that is maybe too quick to understand what's happening, and they just take what the president says quickly. The AP does that a lot too, especially their social media. That's different than your journalist's social media question. That's where it's part of the job of the AP is to say like what's happening. But I think people in the news business are really trying to grapple with how do we hit a moving target like this. And some have been better. Some institutions are better than others. Some are better on certain days than other days. They just have to keep up the same level of energy and vigilantly do their job. And I think they've gotten better at it in the presidency than they had during the campaign. And I think that's all you can hope for, is that you still have a lot of journalists in the industry as opposed to the cuts that we've been seeing.
I'm just going to add one question, but let me just make one remark. I think one of the reasons I think that it was a 5-day-old map was because the press has been covering the fact that it was a 5-day-old map. I think there's a lot more fact-checking embedded in stories now than there's ever been. It's hard to keep pace because anytime a president says something, you have to chase it. And then you have to try to context it, and it's often hard to keep up. But I think there's been more of that than ever before, and everybody's trying to, as you mentioned, soul search about how to best do it. But the question I wanted to end with, and this goes back to something you said a few minutes ago. I thought I heard some semi-groans, but I might have imagined it. When you just said in passing that you think he has roughly a 50% chance of winning re-election, and I was curious what you based that on, based on what you've learned about him, because it's clear that he's not a conventional politician, and a lot of people really relate to that. A lot of the people in your book talk about that. He tapped into a sort of broad, fed up with politics as usual kind of sentiment among a lot of people, and he tapped into that. Is that partly what you ascribe his potential 50% chance to?
Yeah, I think he's got a base that isn't going to go away, that's going to support him because they're attracted to him in his fight on Washington and fight on Democrats. I think Democrats have to probably raise the reputation of their party by covering issues, by addressing issues of healthcare, climate change, transportation, housing, just the things that people really care about that are not, wedded to the president and his personality. And I think that, a generic Democrat is doing very well against Trump. But what happens when the Democrats pick someone and then Trump will have a soft target to attack, and people will either say, well, my life as it currently is fine and hasn't gotten better, it hasn't gotten worse, but it's okay. I don't know if I want to risk a new president. Or they'll say, I'm tired of this guy. I don't trust him. life hasn't gotten especially better. So I think that's whatever the answers to those questions are is going to determine the outcome in multiple states. And it might be different answers depending on where you live. So I don't know, like Pennsylvania is probably going to be the key state.
Yep.
I don't know what, I'm not from here. I don't know whether people in Pennsylvania are going to say, let's give him another chance or not. And I think if they say no, he's going to have a very hard time winning. So the Russians, right, the Russians.
Well, yeah.
We don't know what they're going to do.
That's right. There's that
this time.
factor. We don't know.
We don't know whether we're going to see fake videos coming into Instagram and social media about, attacking the Democratic nominee, whoever he or she is. We don't know. So yeah, there's plenty of, we don't know how the economy is going to shape out, whether we're going to have negative interest rates. I don't know. Have we ever had negative interest rates in our
Not to
lifetime?
my knowledge.
That's not good. But yeah, I don't know what's going to happen.
And we don't know whether Trump is joking when he says he wants to stay past 2024. So that's. No, I don't think he knows how to joke.
Yeah. Right. So that's a good. That's a good question. Well, he's got someone he nominated to run their southern district. So Jeffrey Berman, right? He's a professional conservative lawyer. Does the Attorney General of New York go after him for various fraud at the charity? I mean, probably. Does he go to prison? Maybe. I always thought that house arrest would be kinder. Well, you do half the year at Bedminster, and then you do the other half at Mar-a-Lago, and you just put everybody. I mean, the place is big enough. You can just put the whole administration in there, and just shift charter buses or charter plane, and then shift them.
You get credit for time served.
So that could be.
Humor helps us navigate this phase of our history. Thank you all for coming today. Let's thank Aaron.
Well, we did. What did we do on MSNBC? We haven't done MSNBC too much. We did CNN and a couple of other. Gonna get the shots of the audience.
Do you know that he fits every diagnosis of the DSM-3 or
3, 4. Yeah. People